Hello everyone, this is Matt Woods at the First Alert 4 Digital News Desk. I'm here with investigative reporter Lauren Trager to talk about her new series, Kids or Criminals. So let's go behind the story a little bit. First of all, Lauren, how did this series come about?
Well, it's something that we, of course, cover all the time, and I think it's been back in the headlines this summer, specifically kids who are committing crimes. We've heard from police chiefs who are talking about the system and whether or not the system needs to change. There needs to be more accountability for kids who are out there doing things they maybe should not be doing. But it is that central question of these are not adults. They are not people who have, already reached the age of 18, and so they go right into the basic adult court system. These are children, and it's sort of getting at that question of how should they be treated? How is it best to maybe get them back on the right path and at the same time balance the interests of the community to be protected and safe as well?
Mm-hmm. And these courts operate largely in secrecy. So why is that? Why are a lot of these cases kept secret?
Well, I think it's important to note, too, that there are far fewer juvenile cases than there are adult cases, so it's not something that we hear about all of the time. But Missouri law does allow for the public and the media to observe some of these cases because the courts have found that there is interest to the public and to the community to have access to what's going on in these courtrooms. A lot of these cases, though, are closed. Just by law, you cannot access them, and that is for a reason that people would argue these are children, and sometimes there are very sensitive issues going on. For example, these same court systems, they also handle abuse and neglect cases, for example. They're handling kids who are in the foster system. Sometimes those cases intersect. You might have a child who is accused of a criminal violation, but they might also have some substance abuse or other things going on in their family life that, by their very nature are very private things. And again, these are not people who have reached adulthood. They are still children. And so the courts have kind of said, we need to handle this differently, but also balance the public's interest. So we did have to fight in several cases and sort of make our argument that we should get a chance to observe, at least to see how the courts are working.
Mm-hmm. So essentially you had to petition the court and say, will you please allow us in to see proceedings. Was it for a specific case, or was it like a docket for a day? Can you kind of explain that?
Well, there is no specific docket that you can just go look at and say, okay, John Smith is going to be in court. It kind of operates a little bit differently. We had to work with the court, so to speak, to kind of find out what cases were going to be handled. But it's been going on over the last several months that I've been sitting in on some of these cases. In almost every single case, the defense attorney for the child has tried to say, we don't want the media or the public to be there. They made arguments about the sensitivity of the case or maybe what was going on with that specific juvenile. And in those cases, we had to stand up before the judge. I did and said, Judge, we do believe that the law allows us to be here. We also do not report juveniles' names. We're not trying to, disrespect anyone's privacy, but we are trying to observe the system, see how it works so that we could then better explain it to our viewers.
And what are maybe one or two cases that stuck out to you? What kind of crimes were they accused of?
Yeah, specifically, again, we're allowed to see the ones that are a little more of this more serious nature. So the very serious, the top level felonies, or some of the cases that I sat in on were hearings to determine whether or not a child should stand trial as an adult. So they're called adult certification hearings. It's not really about guilt or innocence necessarily. It's not the facts of the case, but it's kind of looking at what's been going on with this juvenile, their past history. Have they already interacted with the court system before? Do they have a supportive home environment? Basically, are they sophisticated enough? The nature of the crime. So some of these cases were very serious, all the way up to murder, that people under the age of 18 are accused of committing. And the system has to sort of grapple with what is the best place for them, both from a detention standpoint, which is an issue that's been in the headlines a lot, whether or not they should be detained as their case proceeds, but also whether or not they should go into the adult court system. And that is something that is kind of unique to the last couple of years because of a law change that I know you want to ask about in a few minutes.
Right, yeah, we'll definitely get to that. And for people who maybe don't understand, like sometimes we will report the name of a maybe 16 or 17-year-old who has been charged with murder, and that's after the adult certification process, and then the courts will let us know that they've been certified, and then we report that because that's our duty to report stuff like that to the public, although they do have to get certified before that happens. And so the point system of tracking whether or not a juvenile gets detained, right? How does that work?
Yeah, and it's an important question because a lot of people are kind of questioning it and whether that system might need to be reformed somewhat. But essentially, there are attorneys and there are deputy juvenile officers who kind of look into the juvenile's background. And there's a point system that determines, okay, based on the nature of the charge. For example, if a juvenile is detained for murder, they're going to stay detained at that point. But if it's something like property damage or if it's fleeing from the police, something like that, they're going to look at the rest of this matrix. It's a rubric or a scorecard, if you could say it like kind of like that, where it says, okay, now let's look to see, have they had a past history with the court system? Are there other sort of mitigating factors? Maybe, they will even look at, let's say the juvenile is pregnant or something like that. They will assess a certain number of points, but the courts told me what's important to remember is that there is still discretion. So just because they fall in a certain place on the point system doesn't automatically mean detained or not detained. The attorneys and the juvenile officers can look at that and say, you know what, I think this person might need to stay detained, or this person could go home to an environment where maybe an ankle monitor is more appropriate, or house arrest, something like that. Again, what they're trying to they tell me is the philosophy is they should try to use the least restrictive means that both protects the juvenile and the community. So if the juvenile is a danger to the community, that's something that they really weigh. But at the end of the day, they try hard to keep juveniles from being detained because, again, they say these are children. That is what society and community has asked of them, is to try to use the least restrictive means.
So there's a new law about the age on when someone is no longer a juvenile. When was that change enacted?
Well, it was enacted back in 2017 or so is when the legislature passed it. It wasn't really put into effect, though, until 2021. So it's kind of only been in recent years, post-COVID, that we have started to see the real impact of what that change in the law meant. And what it was is that in Missouri, prior to that law going into effect, if you were 17 years old, you automatically went into the adult criminal system. You went to adult jail, you went into the adult courts. Now it is 18. Again, that was sort of a nationwide movement, not just Missouri that was considering this, but Missouri did pass that law that says if you're under the age of 18, you're considered a juvenile in the eyes of the courts. That, though, I was told through this reporting, has put an immense strain on the system because suddenly they have way more cases than they used to. 17-year-olds used to be, in regular criminal court. Now they are in the juvenile system. It also means that in detention, there's older and somewhat more sophisticated kids and teens in that system too. The problem is, the St. Louis City courts told me that it increased their caseload by 40%, but they certainly didn't get a 40% bump in budget or in resources or in programs or in staff. And so it really has had an impact on the cases that they're handling. The most significant impact is that they are having to certify more kids now to stand trial as adult than ever before.
And so has there been a push to allocate more resources to that treatment court, or are we kind of still dealing with the initial phase of, oh, now we have way more cases and we're still trying to figure out what to do about it?
That was part of the reason there was a delay from when the law was passed to when it went into effect. The state did give a little bit more funding to the courts, and the city had to do that too. They had to kind of figure out how they're going to do this. It just wasn't commensurate to the amount of new cases that they now have. Again, there was not that 40% bump in funding and in staffing. So they have 40% more cases, not the same amount. They say they are making the best that they can and doing the very best that they can. And again, every court circuit is different. For example, in St. Louis County, one of their biggest problems is actually their detention center is often at capacity. St. Louis City doesn't have that same issue. They have more beds, so to speak, but sometimes it's about they don't have enough of the staff there to be with those kids. They don't call them corrections officers in that detention. They are youth leaders because, again, it's not supposed to be a jail. It's not supposed to be punitive. These are children, and so it's a detention more of like a residential home. There's even a school in St. Louis City's detention facility. But it's about staffing and resources. It's not just, the dollar-to-dollar amount or bed space.
And so I imagine it was really tough to get people to talk to you about this system, let alone get in the courtroom, but also talking about such sensitive subjects, these kids who are caught up in the criminal justice system. How did you get you have a family of a juvenile who was charged with a pretty serious crime. How did you go about getting them to speak with you for this?
You're right, though. It was difficult to get folks to talk, and you can understand. I mean, no one wants to be branded with a scarlet letter of this was a child who got caught up in the criminal system, even underage. I mean, it's a system that we know, of course, is pervasive throughout our community. Again, adults more so than juveniles, but it's hard. And I could see a lot of the emotion for the parents and the families of these teens that were going through this process on both sides. You know, in some cases you had family members who were on the victim's side, you know, because they were there saying this teenager, this juvenile needs to be held accountable for what they did to our child. And on the other hand, you often had parents or aunts, uncles, loved ones, friends who were there advocating on behalf of the juvenile who was essentially in trouble. And they were very emotional. I mean, I saw a lot of tears in court, a lot of people who said, you know, they felt like the system was either too tough or not tough enough. And it's a difficult thing. So we did talk to a number of people, tried to gather as much information and hear from voices that we don't normally hear from. You mentioned, you know, this 17-year-old, he's really tried to take a second chance from the court system. He knows what he did was not okay, and he knows he was headed down a not great path, and his life could have changed significantly. He actually credits the court system and some programs that he got into to really helping him. His mom does too. So I think that's a powerful voice. Even to hear from the courts themselves, I was really grateful that they sat down with me, both on camera and off camera, to explain how things work and kind of really help us understand. So hopefully we can better explain it to the public as well. But that's just something that, again, by its nature, because it involves children and juveniles, they just don't often do. They can't talk about specific cases and things. So it was really kind of about, hey, letting the courts know I'm here to observe, I want to learn. We wanted to look at this holistically and try to present it in the most fair and balanced way, which is, of course, everything we strive for always. But given the sensitive nature and the difficult nature of some of these issues, we wanted to be extra careful in that.
And at the end of the day, you know, we try to find potential solutions in our reporting to forward this story. You know, this isn't just about exposing a problem, but also seeing what can be done about it. So what were some of those potential solutions that you heard that maybe could be spurred from a series like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's a big part of a broader conversation about how we handle violent crime in America, in all major cities in the country right now. That's certainly top of mind in a lot of topics. I think I heard from people that the courts, so the police, cannot do it alone, that some of those programs where the community wraps its arms around these juveniles and the parents is an important component. But there are others, of course, we're talking about maybe more accountability for parents. I know we've heard conversations about whether it's ticketing parents or, you know, charging them with crimes where they're not watching their children or violating curfews, things like that. That is one solution that has been offered by some people. Others say that that point system does need some reform. It was last looked at in 2013. So there are some, including many police chiefs in our area, who are arguing that needs to get a little bit tougher. So it is an ongoing conversation, I think, is a big part of it. But we did talk with the Urban League, and they have a new program that they are actually partnering with the St. Louis County Juvenile Courts with called Reroute, that you can learn a little bit more about in this series, but where they are saying, look, we really have to meet these juveniles where they are, because even detention, even the consequences that might be facing them don't always speak to them in the same way that maybe giving them additional support outside of the court system could help them with. But it is certainly an ongoing conversation, and one we welcome a lot more feedback on too. If anybody has anything that they think we should be looking into, possible story ideas, or if there's programs that you're aware of, we definitely want to hear about those, because there's more work to be done, certainly.
Absolutely.